Hello, my name's Neal Hooker and I'm a professor of food policy here at the John Glenn School of Public Affairs, and I'd like to talk about some of our recent research looking at the public health impact of food reformulation. We were interested in looking at a particular food policy that had been tried by the US and Canadian governments, and what that policy was adding the trans fat content onto our nutrition facts panel that we'll see on all processed foods. The second part of the policy was the standard, or the criteria used, for a product to claim that it is trans fat free. Why the US and why Canada? Well, Canada tried a little bit more aggressive approach to this front of pack standard, making it harder for processed foods to claim that they were trans fat free. The second part that they did differently was to not just think about the trans fat content, but also to think about the saturated fat content. Why that was interesting to compare is that we, in an earlier study, had found that as the trans fat content went down in products after this labeling change that happened in 2006, we actually saw a slight increase in some saturated fat content. So the food companies were merely switching ingredients away from trans fat and perhaps towards products or ingredients that had higher saturated fat content. So we wanted to see if this trend was still happening and if the different approach that the Canadians had used compared to the US made a difference. This research tried to break down the response of these food companies into several steps. How did the companies learn about this need to reformulate their product? How did they choose to respond, and when did they respond? Did they reformulate their entire product range or certain types of products only? After they reformulated, did they change back to the old model, or did they keep moving forward? And then finally, how did they talk to their customers about these new products? And how did they particularly price their new products? So we put that flow together: diffusion, adoption, assimilation, adherence, and marketing. We chose to look at cookies in this study because cookies are a significant source of trans fat in both the US and the Canadian diet. And the data that we use came from a commercial source that tracks all new processed food products launched in the US and Canadian markets. So as a new cookie was launched, we had the information, the product pictures, the nutritional criteria for each of these products, and we assessed over 2,000 cookies introduced from 2006 through 2012. So what did we find? We found that trans fat content declined over time, so that's a good story. We found that saturated fat content remained relatively constant. We found that the US and Canadian results were very similar. So in other words, even with the different policy approach, there wasn't very different changes in the nutritional quality of cookies on either side of the border. What we interestingly found in this study was that certain types of cookies were less healthy than others. In particular, those cookies that are private label products or branded by a particular grocery store were generally had a higher trans fat content than the national branded products. When we looked at price, we found that cookies with trans fat were cheaper than cookies with lower trans fat or no trans fat in both the US and Canada. So there is a price for nutritional quality. Why is this study important now? Well, in 2014, the US Food and Drug Administration is considering restricting further the use of trans fats in processed foods. And the way that they'll do that is by requiring firms that use partially hydrogenated vegetable oils to demonstrate that the use of these lipids in their processed foods is safe. This is changing the way that we regulate these oils in processed foods. Up until now, all of these ingredients had been classified as generally recognized as safe or GRAS. And GRAS products can be used without prior approval. Changing that, though, doesn't ban trans fats in processed foods. Instead, what it does is place the emphasis onto food companies to demonstrate that their use is not unsafe. So that will be interesting to see what happens from here, particularly given the results that we've found that suggest that trans fats have continued to decline from 2006 to 2012, at least in cookies, but that they could still go further, that we could see even less trans fat in our diets.